The F-15 Eagle had never lost. Not once. Not in training, not in combat. Over 100 kills, 0 losses. The most feared fighter jet in the sky. And on a quiet grey afternoon over England, 2 of them went hunting. Their target? A single British training jet. This was supposed to be easy. It was easy. Just not for the Americans. The year is 2004. Over the Lake District, England. A grey afternoon. Low clouds. The kind of sky that swallows sound and swallows secrets. Below, the lakes of Windermere stretch out like broken mirrors across the valley floor. Above, at altitude, a single RAF Eurofighter Typhoon is cruising. Calm, routine. A 2-seat trainer variant, the kind used to take student pilots through their paces. Not a frontline combat jet on a combat mission, a training aircraft in British airspace on a quiet afternoon flight. Nobody was expecting a fight. That was the point. Because without warning, without radio call, without courtesy, without mercy, 2 United States Air Force F-15E Strike Eagles dropped out of the clouds behind it. No announcement, no warning. Just 2 of the most lethal aircraft ever built, falling into position behind a British jet that had absolutely no idea they were coming. In fighter pilot language, this is called a bounce, and a bounce is not a fair fight. It was never meant to be. A bounce is an ambush. It is a predator choosing its moment. It is position, surprise, and aggression delivered simultaneously. Historically, this is how most air-to-air kills happen. Not in dramatic head-on jousting, not in Hollywood-turning fights, but in sudden, cold, lethal attacks from the blind spot. From behind, from above, from nowhere. The F-15E pilots had chosen their moment perfectly. They had position, they had numbers, they had surprise, and they had something else. Something heavier than all of those things combined. They had history. The F-15 Eagle was not just an aircraft. It was a statement. Born from the failures of Vietnam, where American pilots flying F-4 Phantoms had been humiliated by smaller, lighter Soviet-built MiGs, the F-15 was the Pentagon's answer, its promise, its revenge. Every single design decision, the enormous twin engines, the massive winger, the advanced radar, the long-range missiles, was made in service of one mission and one mission only: kill other aircraft. Nothing else. No ground attack, no secondary roles, no compromise, just dominance. When the F-15 entered service in 1976, it did not just become the best fighter in the world. It entered a completely different category from everything else flying. Faster, more powerful, more aware, more deadly. The aircraft that could threaten an F-15 existed only on paper, in classified threat assessments, in the nightmares of Soviet planners who understood exactly what they were facing. In the real sky, against real enemies, the Eagle was untouchable. Over Israel, American-supplied F-15s tore through Syrian Air Force formations like they were nothing. Over Iraq, the Eagle enforced the skies with complete, unchallenged authority. In every theater, against every opponent, the result was the same. The F-15 won. Always. By the time those 2 Strike Eagles dropped out of the clouds over the Lake District, the F-15's air-to-air combat record stood at over 100 kills. 0 losses. Not one aircraft, not one engagement. The most battle-tested fighter jet in the history of air combat had never, not once in its entire operational life, been shot down in an air-to-air engagement. That record was not luck. It was engineering. It was training. It was decades of accumulated American air combat dominance poured into one aircraft and proven repeatedly against the best the world could throw at it. So when those 2 F-15E pilots spotted the British trainer ahead of them that grey afternoon, their confidence was not arrogance. It was mathematics. It was history. It was the combined weight of every engagement the Eagle had ever won, sitting on their shoulders, telling them exactly how this was going to end. Two of the most experienced fighter pilots in the world. Fly in one of the most lethal aircraft ever built, against a single British training jet, in British airspace, caught completely off guard. This was going to be quick. It was going to be easy. It was going to be another entry in a record that nobody had ever managed to scratch. They dropped into position. They locked their radars. They prepared to kill. And somewhere ahead of them, in that grey English sky, a British crew who had absolutely no idea what was coming was about to do something nobody expected. Something that would be buried, classified, and hushed up for years. Something that rewrote everything. While American engineers were perfecting the F-15 in the 1970s, something else was happening in Europe. Something quieter, something slower, something far less certain. Britain, Germany, Italy, and Spain had a problem. Their existing fighters were aging. The Soviet threat was evolving, and none of them, not one, had the money, the industrial base, or the political will to build a next-generation replacement alone. So they decided to do something that Europeans are historically terrible at. They decided to agree. 4 countries, 4 governments, 4 defense industries, 4 sets of national priorities, political egos, budget pressures, and engineering philosophies, all pointed at a single aircraft. What followed was not a triumph of European cooperation. It was a decade of arguments. Design disputes that nearly killed the program before it began. Budget fights that dragged on for years. Countries threatening to pull out. Specifications rewritten, revised, and rewritten again. Political summits held over the wingspan of a jet that didn't exist yet. Britain wanted one thing. Germany wanted another. Italy had its own demands. Spain arrived late and complicated everything further. And underneath all of it, the clock was ticking. The Soviet threat the aircraft was designed to counter was evolving. The world was moving. And the Eurofighter, not yet named, not yet built, barely agreed upon, was falling behind before its first component had ever been manufactured. When it finally emerged, it did not arrive quietly or triumphantly. It arrived late. It arrived over budget. And it arrived under a cloud of skepticism so thick that even the countries that had built it weren't entirely sure they believed in it. 10 years behind schedule, $8 billion over budget, a program that had survived more near-death experiences than any aircraft in modern European history. The critics were brutal. What exactly had 4 nations spent 20 years arguing about? Was this jet, designed in the 1980s to fight Soviet aircraft that no longer existed, in a Cold War that had already ended, worth the staggering cost? Could it justify the political damage, the budget overruns, the decades of delay? The Eurofighter Typhoon entered RAF service in 2003, and it walked immediately into a wall of doubt. Defense journalists questioned its radar, politicians questioned its price tag, rival manufacturers questioned everything. The French, who had walked away from the program early to build the Rafale alone, watched with barely concealed satisfaction as the arguments continued. Even within the RAF, there were questions. Was this jet everything it was supposed to be? Or was it an expensive political compromise? A jet designed by committee, built by argument, delivered by exhaustion? What the critics were missing, what almost everyone outside of the test pilots and engineers who had actually pushed it to its limits was missing, was what the Typhoon could do when it was unleashed. The canard delta wing configuration, those small forward fins combined with the large triangular main wings. It gave the Typhoon an aerodynamic character unlike any American fighter ever built. Where the F-15 was powerful and imposing, a linebacker in the sky, the Typhoon was something different entirely. Twitchy, responsive, almost unnervingly agile at low speeds. A jet that seemed to think about what you wanted before you finished asking. The twin EJ-200 engines were brutally overpowered for the aircraft's size, which meant one specific thing in a dogfight. When the Typhoon bled energy in a hard maneuvering turn, which every aircraft does, physics does not care about your budget, it got that energy back faster than almost anything it would ever face. As one RAF pilot described, put it simply and precisely, any aircraft will lose energy during the air combat merge. What the Typhoon does is regain this energy very quickly in order to make the next shot. In a turning fight, in a close-range knife-edge engagement where gravity and physics matter more than radar range and missile specifications, that single characteristic was not a small advantage. It was potentially decisive. The Americans knew the Typhoon existed. They had read the specifications. They had attended the air shows. They had watched it perform in the static displays and the flying demonstrations. They just didn't think it would matter. Not against an F-15, not 2 against 1, not in a real fight. They had read about the delays. They had heard about the budget overruns. They had watched a program stumble towards service for 20 years and arrived at a conclusion that felt like common sense. Late, expensive, European meant inferior. That assumption was about to have consequences. Because over the Lake District, those 2 F-15E pilots had just committed to a close-range visual engagement. They had just stepped into the Typhoon's world. And in the Typhoon's world, the rules were about to change completely. Let's go back to that grey afternoon. Back to the clouds over Windermere. Back to the moment 2 F-15E Strike Eagles dropped out of the sky behind a British training jet that never saw them coming. The American pilots had done everything right. Tactically, this was textbook. Choose your moment, gain position, attack from behind, from the blind spot, from the one angle where the enemy cannot see you, cannot react, cannot defend. In fighter aviation, this is not considered unsporting. It is considered professional. It is how you survive. It is how you win. And they had executed it perfectly. Position. Confirmed. Numbers. 2 against 1. Surprise. Total. The British crew had no warning, no radar alert, no radio call, nothing. One moment they were cruising over the lakes in a routine training flight. The next moment, 2 of the most lethal fighter jets ever built were sitting behind them, radars locked, fingers ready. In a real engagement, it would have been over in seconds. The F-15E pilots intended to pursue the British jet for several miles, lock their radars, hold the lock long enough that in any real-world scenario, any actual combat situation, the Typhoon would have been destroyed. It was not meant to be a fight. It was meant to be a demonstration. The casual, almost contemptuous demonstration of what happens when you put 2 battle-proven American fighters against a single European trainer that had barely entered service. Quick, clean, inevitable. Except the Typhoon didn't cooperate. What happened next is the part that was buried, classified, hushed up for years. The part that the British government did not issue a press release about, and the RAF did not hold a press conference to celebrate. Because what happened next was not supposed to be possible. The Typhoon moved, not panicked movement, not desperate random evasion, precise, controlled, ferocious movement, and the kind that comes from a jet that was built for exactly this moment, close range, within visual range, back against the wall, energy bleeding, opponent behind you, no margin for error. The canard delta wing bit into the air. The EJ-200 engines answered immediately, and the Typhoon began to turn. The F-15E pilots pushed to follow. These were not average pilots. These were highly trained professionals with thousands of hours in one of the most capable fighter jets ever built. They had trained for exactly this kind of engagement. They knew what they were doing. But something was wrong. The Typhoon wasn't dying. It was pulling, turning, bleeding speed in the turn, but, and this was the part that didn't make sense, getting it back. Faster than it should have. Faster than the F-15 pilots had expected. Faster than the specifications they had read suggested was possible. Every time the Eagles tried to solve the geometry, to put their nose where the Typhoon was going to be, to lock a firing solution, The British jet moved again. Precise, controlled, relentless. The hunters were working harder than they expected. And then, something shifted. The Typhoon stopped running. It turned into them. In fighter aviation, there is a moment in a close-range engagement, a specific, decisive moment, where the balance tips, where the aircraft that was defending becomes the aircraft that is attacking, where the geometry of the fight flips completely, and suddenly the pilot who thought he was winning realizes he is losing. That moment happened over Windermere. The two F-15E pilots, who had dropped out of those clouds with position, numbers, surprise, and the accumulated weight of aviation history on their side, found themselves looking at a British jet that had moved behind them. Both of them. Read that again. An ambushed British training jet, caught from behind, by two of the most experienced fighter pilots in the world, flying the most battle-proven aircraft in aviation history, had turned the tables completely. The hunters became the hunted. The aircraft that was supposed to be dead in seconds had both F-15s in its sights. The Typhoon crew, and this detail matters, were almost as surprised as the Americans. This was not a planned exercise with scripted outcomes. This was not a controlled environment where the result had been agreed in advance. This was as close to a real encounter as military aviation ever produces. The British pilots did not know it was coming. They had no time to prepare, no time to think. They reacted. They maneuvered. They won. The F-15E pilots flew back to base, having experienced something their aircraft's entire combat record had never once prepared them for: the feeling of being outflown. And in classified debriefs, in hushed conversations, in defense ministry corridors on both sides of the Atlantic, one question kept coming back: how? How? That single word hung in the air like smoke after a gunfight. How does a training variant of a European jet, late to service, over budget, written off by half the defense community before it ever fired a weapon, turn around and defeat two F-15E Strike Eagles that had dropped out of the clouds behind it with every possible advantage? How does the hunted become the hunter? How does the aircraft that nobody believed in beat the aircraft that nobody had ever beaten? The answer is not simple. It never is with aviation. But it starts with one fundamental truth that military establishments have had to relearn in every generation since the jet age began. Assumption kills. Not missiles, not radar, not engine power. Assumption. The F-15 was built in an era when the dogfight was supposed to be dying. The thinking in the 1970s was clean and logical. Missiles were getting better. Radar was getting longer. You would see the enemy first. You would shoot first. You would kill first, before they ever knew you were there. The close-range turning fight, the knife edge, gravity-punishing, energy-bleeding merge was considered a relic, a holdover from a previous era that modern technology had made obsolete. The F-15's enormous radar and long-range missiles reflected that philosophy completely. It was built to see far, shoot far, and win before the merge ever happened. That philosophy worked. For decades it worked brilliantly. But over Windermere, those two F-15E pilots had made a choice. They had chosen to bounce the Typhoon from behind. They had chosen to commit to a close-range visual engagement. They had stepped deliberately out of the F-15's world of long-range radar dominance and into a knife edge, turning fight at low altitude over a lake in northern England. They had stepped into the Typhoon's world, and in the Typhoon's world, the rules were written differently. The Typhoon was not designed as a compromise. It was not designed as a political gesture or a symbol of European cooperation. Underneath all the arguments and the budget overruns and the decade of delays was an aircraft built around one specific capability: close-range air superiority. The Canard Delta configuration was not a styling choice. Those forward fins combined with the massive triangular main wings created an aerodynamic character that was genuinely unlike anything the Americans had encountered in a real engagement. instantaneous turn rate that defied the aircraft's size, energy retention that defied the laws of what a maneuvering jet should be able to do. The EJ-200 engines were brutally, almost excessively overpowered, which meant that in a turning fight, where every aircraft bleeds energy, where physics is the only referee, where the jet that recovers fastest gets the next shot, the Typhoon was operating in territory it had been specifically engineered to own. The F-15E pilots had not flown into a fair fight that went against them. They had flown into the one specific scenario where the Typhoon's every design advantage aligned perfectly against the F-15's every design assumption. They paid for that over Windermere. Governments are not good at keeping good news secret. Bad news, yes. Embarrassment sometimes. But genuine, unexpected military triumph has a way of leaking. Through defense journalists, through aviation forums, through the kind of careful sourced reporting that occasionally pulls classified embarrassments into the public domain. The British government stayed quiet officially. The RAF held no press conference. The episode was buried, deliberately, carefully, for fear of causing what one report described simply as US blushes. Because Britain and America do not just share a language and a history, they share pilots, they share bases, they share intel, legions. They fight together and train together and depend on each other in ways that go far deeper than any single encounter over any single lake. The last thing the British government wanted was for one grey afternoon over Windermere to become a diplomatic incident. So, officially, it didn't happen. But it got out anyway. And when the details emerged, one British trainer, 2 American frontline fighters, outcome reversed. The reaction was everything the British government had feared, and everything the aviation world found utterly fascinating. Reports also emerged quietly, carefully, through the same channels that the Lake District story had travelled, that 2 RAF Typhoons deployed to the United States for operational evaluation trials had been flying against the F-22 Raptor at NAS China Lake, the most advanced fighter jet America had ever built. The aircraft that had made the F-15 itself feel outdated. And the Typhoon had performed better than expected, significantly better. In close range within visual range combat, the same conditions that had decided the fight over Windermere, the Typhoon's agility and high off-boresight missile capability had allowed it to compete with an aircraft an entire generation more advanced. The pattern was consistent. The conclusion was becoming impossible to ignore. Put the Typhoon in a close-range fight, give it pilots who knew what they were doing, and the jet that everyone had spent years dismissing had a habit of winning. Here is the truth that the encounter over the Lake District revealed. Not that the F-15 is a bad aircraft. It is not. It is one of the finest fighters ever built with a combat record that stands comparison with anything that has ever flown. The pilots who bounced the Typhoon that afternoon were not incompetent. They were professionals executing a textbook attack with a world-class aircraft. The problem was never the jet. The problem was never the crew. The problem was the assumption that late meant inferior, that expensive meant wasted, that European meant second-rate, that an aircraft everyone had spent a decade writing off could not possibly turn the tables on 2 of the best fighters in the world. Assumptions do not care about your combat record. They do not care about your kill ratio. They do not care about your history or your reputation or the weight of every engagement you have ever won. They simply wait, quietly, patiently, until the moment you stop questioning them, and then they collect their price. Over Windermere, on a grey afternoon, under low clouds, above a lake that reflected nothing but sky, the most battle-proven fighter jet in aviation history met an aircraft it had decided in advance it did not need to respect. The F-15's combat record remained intact. No kill markings were added, no press releases were issued, no ceremonies were held. But in the quiet skies above England, in a fight that was hushed up and buried and never officially acknowledged, the aircraft that was never supposed to compete had done something far more significant than compete. It had won. quietly, completely, undeniably. One maneuver at a time, against the best opposition available. And nobody, not the Americans, not the RAF, not the procurement officials who had spent a decade writing the Typhoon off, had seen it coming.